The G8 leaders' statement on countering terrorism is a fairly long and fairly comprehensive document that reflects an attempt to cover all possible bases when discussing the problem of terrorism and the G8's potential solutions to them. It is the kind of document that reflects the work of a committee. It's evident that various countries' particular concerns jockeyed for position in it, and that the authors, at the end of the day, made a number of compromises in order to ensure that everyone could sign off on it. So, for example, it begins with the statement, "We, the leaders of the G8, reiterate our absolute condemnation of terrorism in all of its forms and manifestations." There is no internationally agreed-upon definition of terrorism, and so it is imprecise to say that we condemn it in all of its forms and manifestations. It leaves open room for creative ambiguity. It does not constrain any of the G8 countries from saying that the particular insurgencies or terrorist groups that they are especially interested in fighting are immune from G8 concern. However, there are, of course, tensions within the G8 as to exactly which groups do count as terrorism. It's just that the G8, in an effort to maintain a degree of harmony, does not highlight the fact that there are differences on this score. The key point from the perspective of the largest G8 countries, especially the United States and Britain and France, is that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are what they are primarily concerned about when they condemn terrorism, as the document later makes specific reference to welcoming improvements to the UN, Al-Qaeda, and Taliban sanctions regime. The failure to define terrorism internationally is, of course, one of the great reasons why it is difficult to mobilize international cooperation against terrorism, because some countries steadfastly refuse to agree that certain kinds of groups are terrorist groups. In the Middle East, for example, in the Arab and Islamic world, broadly speaking, Palestinian groups fighting for the liberation of their homeland are generally not seen to be terrorist groups because they are thought to have a fully justified motivation for conducting operations against Israeli occupiers. The G8 statement in its second paragraph goes out of its way to say, quote, "All acts of terrorism are criminal, inhumane, and unjustifiable, irrespective of motivation," unquote. So this is an attempt to say that it is really the act rather than the motive that defines something as terroristic. But again, it does not specifically say that all acts of violence are inherently terror, or that only certain kinds of targets count as terrorist targets, and so forth. This is particularly important because there is a view that we ought to be speaking about state terrorism. And from this perspective, it can be argued that states, when they use force against the will of the peoples that they are using force against, are in fact engaged themselves in acts of terrorism. And it's popular in some parts of the world, for example, to describe American policy in both Iraq and Afghanistan as state terrorism. Obviously, the G8 is not intending to signal a condemnation of that. Another very interesting feature of this statement is that it does actually say, quite clearly, that extensive international cooperation has weakened the ability of terrorists to recruit, train, fund, and execute attacks. This is true. Since 9/11, there has been a great deal of improvement in international cooperation in the fight against transnational terror, and it has been largely successful. In many parts of the world, Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda affiliates are essentially out of business because they have been tracked, monitored, mapped, and rounded up by G8 counterterrorism officials and counterterrorism agencies. In the broad scheme of things, the international fight against terrorism, certainly as the United States defines it, is going very well indeed, with certain exceptions. And the document does highlight, in particular, the dangers of terrorism in Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Sahel, Somalia, and Yemen. These are areas usually defined as failed states or failing state regions where recruitment and training of terrorists seems to have been on an uptick in recent years, partly in response to Western countries' policies in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and partly because of insufficient institutional or financial support for counterterrorist activities in these regions themselves. Final fascinating feature of this document is that it does say that the way to fight terrorism in the long run is to fight the root causes, as it were, the reasons why people in certain parts of the world are drawn to terrorist activity. The statement has a very Western focus in its understanding of the root causes of terrorism. And it says, in particular, that it's important to address weaknesses in the rule of law, the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms, democratic values, good governance, tolerance, and inclusiveness. In other words, from the G8 perspective, terrorism is largely a problem caused by undemocratic political systems and illiberal regimes. The solution, of course, from that perspective is to make other countries look more like us. And, of course, one could argue that it's precisely this attitude that has been fanning the flames of terrorism, particularly in the Middle East, where there's a great deal of resentment at the encroachment of Western values and Western forces to try to promote them. From this perspective, of course, the root cause of terrorism is not lack of democratic political institutions, but the fact that Western countries have been imposing their will on other parts of the world for centuries, and these places subject to Western imperialism historically are no longer willing to put up with it. The document, interestingly, also carefully avoids religious, cultural, or ideological sources of terrorism. It attempts to maintain the image that terrorists are really not motivated by religious or ideological considerations, but rather by political frustration and material frustration. Last point, the document notes that it's important, if you're going to fight terrorism effectively, to promote international development. Everyone would agree that where there is poverty, overpopulation, and lack of economic opportunity, particularly for young males in the 18 to 35-year-old demographic bracket, that is where you are more likely to see people radicalized and turn to violence to try to address their dissatisfactions. Development is very expensive, and the document makes no particular commitment of resources to improve development, broadly understood. It does make reference to a commitment, vague without a dollar figure attached to it, to promote the institutional capacity of weak states and weak regions to enhance their counterterrorism capabilities. So overall, the document is, as I say, a comprehensive one. It is a technical one. It very clearly reflects a Western understanding of the causes, nature, and solutions. These are not understandings that would be widely shared in many parts of the world, particularly where terrorists are most active. And there is the rub. If one wants to fight terrorism in the parts of the world where it actually is a serious problem, one probably has to find a way to put oneself in the shoes of the people who do turn to violence there and try to figure out how to make it attractive for them not to do so.